Where I left off last time, the question was, why are these stories told the way they are? Where do they come from? From where do they come? Why does a golden calf story get written? Why'd they make it a golden calf and not a silver snake? Why is there a story about Aaron, the high priest of Israel, committing the greatest sin of all time, arguably, making the golden calf, and lying about it, and getting away with it? And why does someone write the story where Moses hits the rock when he's supposed to speak to the rock? And why does Aaron, who is innocent, it would seem, in that matter, suffer for the sin of Moses? All of that. Is it just that it happened that way, or are there reasons why someone would compose the story the way they do? So where we left off last time, we saw that evidence had been mounting, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, that the 5 books of Moses were not written by Moses and were not written by any one person. They were written by other persons whose names thus far we do not know. And so we speak of their texts by letters that refer to characteristics of them, prominent characteristics. And the most prominent characteristics of 2 of them are this difference of when they think the name of God became known. So one is called J because it refers to God as Yahweh, which in German begins with a J. And the other is called E because they refer to God just as God, which is Elohim, until the time of Moses, and then refer to him as Yahweh. And the third one was called P because it stands for it being a priestly source, and its concerns, you read it, are pretty obviously priestly. There's another one coming. But these will get you at least through Genesis through Numbers. And now I want to examine each of those and see how they come to mean anything. But you should note at least the simple little fact that those letters stand for the texts, not for the authors. Because a lot of people, when you read about this in books or when people talk about it, they'll say, well, Jay tells his story, or, E feels that J and E and P are not the authors, they're the texts. It's like saying that the authors of the Brothers Karamazov is Ivan Karamazov. That's, as many of you know, that's not true. Did you ever see the movie of the Brothers Karamazov? It shows the greatness of Dostoevsky in that book, that they could make a movie that cut out all the deep, heavy stuff that makes it the greatest novel of all time, and still have a decent enough movie, which is interesting. And Dmitri Karamazov is played by Yul Brynner, who had been the Pharaoh in the Moses movie. And Alyosha, the youngest brother, is played by Captain Kirk. So Captain Kirk was the officer of the Starship Enterprise in the earliest rendition, not counting the pilot, of the program Star Trek. In the original pilot, it was Jeffrey Hunter played the captain of the Starship Enterprise. And he had also played Jesus Christ. So you get Moses, you get Jesus, you get all of that is in here. I think these sidelights on literature and history are much more interesting, actually, than the course. I'm afraid that you would agree with me about that. So let's talk about these texts, J and E. Why are there 2 different parallel texts? On the one hand, the fact that there are these different source texts, each telling the story, is not that big a deal, especially to someone who knows the New Testament pretty well. It begins with 4 different versions of the story, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that's fine. And they have a lot of the same issues that those of you who grew up with the New Testament and the Gospels, sometimes they repeat the same information in the different Gospels. Sometimes they seem to contradict each other, and one has to reconcile them through one way or another. And the critical scholars look at it one way, and the traditional scholars look at it another way. It's very similar. But at least they logically put Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We have these sources, J and E and P. And they're all wound around each other instead of separated. And that may be because of the specific historical circumstances that led the editors to choose to do it that way, rather than to create the 4 Old Testament Gospels the way the editors of the New Testament did. And we'll try to understand what were the forces that made them do that. But there is a natural impulse to try to reconcile things. And some of you may know there is a work out there called the Diatessaron, where a scholar really did take the 4 Gospels of the New Testament and wound them around each other and made them into one continuous big super gospel. And that never caught on in Christianity. Most Christians have never heard of the Diatessaron, but all Jews have heard of the Torah, which is this work that combined them all. So it was a different approach. And you take a chance when you do that approach of winding them around each other, because now you're presenting them all as the work of one author. So when there's a contradiction, it's much more in your face and troubling than if there's a contradiction between Matthew and John in the New Testament. So for a long time, you read, if you've started reading Who Wrote the Bible, you know that people went to the tower for questioning this, and people lost their lives for questioning this, and people got excommunicated from their religion for doing this. So it's not a small matter, and the stakes were not small. And the fact that we can just openly kind of talk about this today in a university is more remarkable than you'd think. We live in an age where you can do that, because a couple hundred years ago, some guy would have walked in here and pulled me out of here for teaching you this stuff, and he would have brought me before the Inquisition, and I would have been given a chance to explain myself before they did very bad things to me, So there are these different texts. We'll start with J and E. In some ways, they're very similar, and in some ways, they're strikingly different. They tell a lot of the same stories, and then other stories one tells and the other doesn't. E doesn't start until Genesis 20, which is the second wife-sister of Abraham story. So that means the E text has no creation, no flood, Tower of Babel. All those things that happen before Abraham don't occur in E. It doesn't mean that the E text didn't have these originally. When you read J alone, or you read E alone, you see that neither of them is complete. There are times where you can read J straight through a whole story, and it flows even if another text is cut in between it. But still, if you would just take J out by itself and just read it straight through, you would see every now and then there's a gap in the story. And the same with E. If you read it straight through, every now and then there's a gap in the story. Most notably, the story just seems to start in the middle with a guy named Abraham who hasn't been introduced yet, lying about his wife being his sister. So chances are there was something there, and there's an editor who put these two together. In Bible, the term we use for the editors of the Bible is redactors. It's a truly ugly word. And I don't know why we picked the word redactor. It was probably because E had been used up already, so we couldn't go for editor, so we made them redactors. But a redactor is an editor, and as far as I can tell, I cannot see any difference whatever between what a redactor does and what an editor does. So the person who put these two together, we describe as, you'll see it either written as RJE, the redactor of J and E, or sometimes you'll see it written like this, RJE, like that, which looks more like something they would do like in the math department or something. So it makes it, then we feel more scientific in my field. So this J text, at some point it was noticed that the J text refers to an awful lot of things that relate to the country Judah. And the E text relates to an awful lot of things that only happen to the northern kingdom, Israel. So to return to our map here at its simplest level now, Red Sea. Judah goes right up to about there. Jerusalem, its capital, is right near the border, near the top. From Jerusalem, you can look out and see the Dead Sea from parts of Jerusalem, so it's pretty close. And up here is the northern kingdom of Israel, and now we'll fill in various places. So in Judah, for example, when you meet Abraham, he's located at the city of Hebron. Hebron, you remember, that's where Abraham meets the three visitors who come. And now, that's interesting because Hebron is the capital of Judah. It's in the south. You know, David was there before he was king in Jerusalem. E doesn't have stories in Hebron. In the J text, there's stories about how when the 12 tribes, when they start out as 12 sons of Jacob, as each one is born, there's a story of their parents naming them. The J text has the naming stories of Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, the four oldest brothers. It doesn't have the others. Except when you get to Joseph, where both have Joseph. Because Joseph is famous. So he makes it into both. And there's stories about him in both. But remember, the 12 tribes has Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Now, what does that mean, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah? What happened to those four tribes in history, the Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah? Reuben was located over here. It was one of the tribes that was east of the Jordan River, and indeed east of the Dead Sea. So if you look at where Reuben was on a map, you can see it was the most vulnerable of the tribes of Israel. It was the only one that's actually cut off by water from the other tribes. It's only at its northern border that it even has a connection. And Reuben did, in fact, cease to exist. It's just gone. And that became, you know, the lands of Moab and Edom there, and Reuben went out of business. Simeon was located in this zone here, which is around what is presently the city of Beersheba, which is the biggest city in the southern desert part of Israel. I don't know how much you know of what that world is like. When you get down here near the Dead Sea in the southern part, down to the Red Sea, it's wilderness type climate. It's desert and hasn't been really that great for occupation until the present day, where now they've found all kinds of ways of watering it. So now, I mean, I've been there. It's quite amazing now where they grow all kinds of things, vegetables with hydroponics and that sort of thing. But in biblical times, this part wouldn't have been occupied very much. But the northern part of Israel is not desert in the least. It's got swamps, it's got rivers, it's got lakes, it's got beautiful parks. It's nothing at all like the southern part. And it's amazing, such a small region has such dramatic variety of, you know, because you got beaches over here, you got Jerusalem's on top of mountains. If you count what was Syria until the 1967 war has been occupied since by Israel, just this border near the top of the Galilee there. They get snow up there. Israelis go skiing, you know. And the only decent wine you can get from Israel is grown up there. Israel is always bad for wine because it's just not the right climate at all for growing grapes, except up there. I would tell you my favorite labels, but we're not supposed to advertise, you know. If you're over 21, come over to the house. I'll give you. So Reuben's gone. Simeon is gone. Simeon just got swallowed up by Judah and never became a region of its own. And the third son is Levi, and as you know, Levi is they become this priestly group. They don't have any tribal territories. If you look on a map of ancient Israel, especially once Israel and Judah get going as countries, you won't see Reuben, you won't see Simeon, and you won't see Levi. In short, the only tribe in the J version that exists is Judah. The E source, on the other hand, names all the others. It's got all the Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Ephraim, Manasseh, all the northern tribes. Next, there's that story in Numbers 13 and 14 where Moses and the people have traveled from Egypt, and they're over here, or they're down at this point there, and Moses sends in the spies or scouts to look over the land, and they come back with a report of the land, and in J it describes where they go, looking to see what the land is like. And if you look at all the sites that are mentioned, they're all in Judah. The tribes never see the rest of Israel. The scribes, scribes, spies. Scouts would be a more correct term. They're not spies. They don't spy on anybody. You know, they don't have a double naught number. You know. In J, it says that the ultimate promise of the land is from the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates, and the only time Israel has ever claimed to have achieved that is during the empire of David and Solomon, the two greatest, who really came from Judah originally, not Israel. And that full range, that's only in J, and that's only the kings who came from Judah who did that. In the J text, there are all kinds of stories about the ark, where if they don't take the ark into battle, they don't win. The ark, where is it located? It's in the temple in Jerusalem. It's in Judah. It's not in Israel. Meanwhile, over in the E source, they never once mention the ark. They're very big on the tabernacle, because that was a tent that originally stood in the north at Shiloh. Whereas in the J source, relating to Judah, the tabernacle is never mentioned. So they've only got the tabernacle, they've only got the ark. In J, there's a story about the second and third oldest brothers, Simeon and Levi. And it says, remember the story is in Genesis 34, that they have this sister, Dinah, and Dinah is at the city of Shechem. We pronounce it Shechem in English. And she is either, you can't tell, she's raped, seduced, they just liked each other and slept together. You can't tell, but there is sex between Dinah and the prince of Shechem, whose name is Shechem. And it's nice if your dad names the town after you, you know. And it says, remember there was this deception involving circumcision, and two of her brothers go and massacre the city of Shechem. And the two brothers who do it are Simeon and Levi. That's in Genesis 34. Together with that story, if you look, in J there's a brief notice about Reuben, the oldest son. It says that he had sex with his father's concubine, Bilhah. That's a really bad idea. And that is a thing. There are a lot of movies of this sort of thing. In cultures where men have harems, there's always the risk that as their sons grow up, the sons will have sex with the wives of the harem. Remember, it happens, in fact, with King David, that when his son Absalom rebels against him, he sleeps with 10 of David's concubines. So, and it's a way of laying claim to your father's thing. And if you want to get into Freudian Oedipal stuff, you can't do much better, right? If you don't want to sleep with your mother, because only Oedipus himself does that one, but you can come real close to achieving your Oedipal, you know, defeat of your father by having sex with your father's various other wives and concubines. And so Reuben does that, it says, and Jacob heard. That's all it says, and then the story just ends. And then you don't get what came out of that until Genesis 49, the deathbed blessing of Jacob. And what does he do? He says, the firstborn is Reuben. He says, you are my son, preeminent in strength. He says, but you won't be preeminent because you went up to your father's couch. You violated your father's bed. That is to say, he takes away the birthright from Reuben because he knows that Reuben slept with one of his women. And then he comes to Simeon and Levi, the second and third, and he says, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Implements of violence are the tools of their trade. Let them be scattered in Israel, he says, dispersed, because they were violent, and that was because, remember, in the story, they do in the people of Shechem, and Jacob is angry and criticizes them for that. And there, too, the story seems to end like the Reuben thing, unfinished. He says to them, after they've massacred Shechem, he says, well, you've made me stink in the nostrils of all the Canaanites. Wherever I go now, they're going to want to kill me. And Reuben and Simeon say, should he treat our sister like a whore? And that's really the wording. And that's the last sentence of the story in Genesis 34. It just ends with them answering their father with that. And then you don't find out what happens till he's on his deathbed and he's giving out his blessing. And you don't want the blessing that some of these brothers get. So Reuben's crossed off, Simeon is crossed off, Levi, the third one, is crossed off, and then it comes to the fourth son, Judah. And he said, Judah, you are the one to whom your brothers will bow down. The scepter will never depart from Judah, meaning the throne, meaning the David family. That is to say, in J, Judah is the favored son. In J, it is only Judah who, besides Joseph, has any story about him. And it's the story of Judah and Tamar, right, which ends with her giving birth to twins, one of whom turns out to be the ancestor of the royal family of Judah. So when you look at all those, you start to add those up, you start seeing more and more of those, that the J stories relate directly to Judah, implying that they're by somebody from Judah. What else can we say about this person? The other stories, if you look at E and P, have a lot of priestly concerns. And so when I get to that, we'll see. They both get traced to priests. And when we come to the final source, which is I'm leaving out until now, which is in Deuteronomy, it's also priestly. But there's no sign that the author of J is priestly. There aren't all the priestly concerns there. Stuff about tabernacles and incense and who's the priest, and it's just not there. It's more these stories that seem to parallel the life of David. So, for example, when I say that Reuben sleeps with his father's concubine, and Simeon and Levi massacre people, they kill someone over an insult sexually to their sister, you go, wait a minute, those are the sins of Absalom. Absalom slept with 10 of his father David's concubines, and Absalom killed his brother Amnon over a sexual assault to his sister Tamar. Something is going on here. It's like if today you wanted to write something insulting some current politician, take the one of your choice. So what you do is you write a story about George Washington. And in it, George Washington's sons and daughters and brothers and sisters do all kinds of bad things. But you make all the bad things that they do the things that the guy you want to criticize today does. You do that in a story. And, the smarter people in the audience get it. And the more blatant you make it, the more even the dummies will get it. And if you look at these stories in J, everybody alive in ancient Judah and Israel would have read these and go, gee, that sounds familiar. And so it's a text that relates to what's going on in Judah. Now let's look at the E text. The E text seems to keep relating to things that are happening in Israel. So in the J text, for example, it says, how was the city of Shechem acquired? It was in this really bad, terrible thing where Simeon and Levi massacred the city and their father disinherited them over that. Or didn't disinherit, lowered them in the birth order chain over that. Now that's really interesting, because what is this city, Shechem? It's the capital of Israel. When Jeroboam broke from the royal family of David and Judah, and they created their own separate country of Israel in the north, its original capital was Shechem. It only became Samaria, remember, much later. So that's somebody in the J text saying, how did those Israelites get their capital up there? Dirty trick violence over sex. In the E text, how did they get it? It says, Jacob acquired a field at Shechem for 100 kesita. He bought it and gives the price. No violence. We have a right to it. We have a claim to it because our ancestor Jacob bought it. In the E text, when Jacob has that wrestling with God story, or an angel, whoever it is with whom Jacob wrestles. At the end of it, he names the place Peniel. Face of God, because he says, I have seen God face to face. Peniel was a city in northern Israel that was built by Jeroboam, the first king of Israel. So the E source has good news about Shechem and good news about Peniel, cities that are associated with its first king. And then the one that tells the most. The E source has the story of the golden calf. Now, let's figure this out. Remember when King David arises to power and he becomes the first king of both Judah and Israel and makes it one united Israel. He needs a high priest, and he picks two high priests. Remember, one of them is a Mushite high priest, a family of priests who traced their descent to Moses. And the other is an Aaronid high priest, a family who traced their descent to Aaron. And then when David was off the throne and died, he was replaced by Solomon. And Solomon, you'll remember, threw out the Mushite high priest, Aviatar, who was also a priest from the north, from Israel. And he kept the Aaronid priest, Zadok, who was from the southern kingdom of Judah. And that meant that the Mushite priests were out. And so it was a member of the Mushite clan who incited Jeroboam to rebel and make Israel its own separate country. But then you remember Jeroboam betrayed, it would appear, the Mushite priests, and he just picked non-Levites to be his priests at Dan and Bethel, the capitals there. And what were his symbols of the religion at Dan and Bethel, the cities, the religious capitals of Israel? Golden calves. What did he say when he put up the golden calves? Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. And now someone who wrote the E stories writes a story and says, what's the worst thing Israel ever did? Golden calf. Now think about this. If the author of the E text is a Mushite priest, what are the two things that bother him the most in the world? That he and his family, descendants of Moses and great leaders in the past, are now out, and they're out in Judah. And the other thing that bothers them the most is that they're out in Israel. What is the symbol of their disenfranchisement, their loss in Judah? Aaron. What is the symbol of their disenfranchisement in Israel? The golden calf. So one of them writes a story, and he says, what's the worst sin Israel ever committed? They made a golden calf. Who made the golden calf? Aaron. It's a double-duty story. He nails everybody he doesn't like in one brilliantly constructed story. And just to make sure, right, Aaron's sons, the first two, are named Nadav and Avihu. Jeroboam, the first king of Israel, has two sons named Nadav and Aviah. Not exact, but close enough to get your attention. That is to say, the two makers of golden calves in the Hebrew Bible say the same words and have sons with the same names. But of course, that's just coincidence. So the story reveals something about the author and helps build a hypothesis that the J text is written by somebody who knows the royal court of the country, because the stories are very similar to the stories of the kings. The E texts are written by a Mushite priest. Now, a lot of people have confused that. They thought the golden calf story in older Bible scholarship was written as part of the J text, that it came from Judah, and that's why it's putting down the golden calves, because those are the religious sites of the other country. But then it didn't make sense. Well, why are they making Aaron the guy who makes the golden calves? Because why are they putting down their own priesthood? But it makes sense if the golden calf story is part of E, where it's by a Mushite priest who's unhappy with both kingdoms. It's not that he's anti-Israel or Judah. I mean, it's not that he's going to, well, I'm moving to Aram, and that's all there is to it. I mean, that's not what he can do about it. So he's got a better shot living in Israel than he does in Judah, but he's still critical of both. And if you think that's not enough, then he has another story where he goes after Aaron as well. And that's the story of Snow White Miriam, in Numbers 12. Now, we call this the Snow White Miriam story. It's not that the Bible scholars are trying to be cute. It's, my teacher, Professor Cross, regularly referred to it as the Snow White Miriam story, and he did so in print. And nobody ever thought that Frank Cross was a person who was trying to be cute. Frank Cross was one of the two deans of American Bible scholarship for a generation, Frank Moore Cross and David Noel Friedman. And Cross was an extraordinarily brilliant, great man. He produced over 100 people did their PhDs under him. And as far as I know, all but one, at least, got tenure-track jobs at universities. So it's like an army of Cross students out there, which has made certain other people somewhat antagonistic towards Cross students, but tough. And since I'm one of them, tough, So, but this remarkable achievement in any field, physics, chemistry, history, in any field, for somebody to produce 100 PhD students, and they're all out there teaching, means, the word of Cross hath been spread. So it's like that. He was the classic absent-minded professor. He was your absolute classic Harvard professor. He wore bow ties and Madras jackets, and when he disagreed with what you were saying, he banged his pipe on the table, on the ashtray while you were talking, and had this very New England accent, which is really interesting because he was from Alabama. And you've met some Southerners who transform, give up their Southern accents. I have friends from Columbus, Georgia, and one of the two sisters transformed herself and got rid of her Southern accent completely, so no one would ever guess that she's from Georgia. But once I was calling on her sister, who was visiting and stayed in Columbus, answered the phone, and she said, "Is that you, Dickie Friedman?" So Cross did that. He backed out of his garage without opening the garage door, and he had a really nice little sports car. It was very sad. He did the classic one. He sawed the branch of a tree, and it was the branch that he was holding on to. And laugh. He broke a vertebra doing that one. I was once invited to a party at Professor Cross's house for all the students, and I was bringing a couple of other students in my car out to Lexington, where he lived, and Lexington, Mass. And when I got there, I'd been sitting drinking and talking for about 20 minutes, and somebody said, "Where's John? He was coming with you." And I said, "No, John was." "Oh my God, John!" And there was somebody and he was left standing on some corner back in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I go running to Mrs. Cross. I said, I don't know what to say. I forgot to bring John. And she just laughed and said, "Oh, Frank does that all the time." And I said, "He's earned it. He's published. I can't do it yet." Now I'm qualified to do that. I knew then I was going to be a great scholar. I was already, doing. So This e-source then would be ascribed, remember the e-source? That's what I was talking about before. This e-source is ascribed in this hypothesis then to somebody living in Israel, and the j-source to somebody living in Judah. The e-source apparently a Mushite priest, most probably. The j-source a non-priest. I even, at the time, when I wrote Who Wrote the Bible, I recognized the possibility that the author of J could be a woman. And a lot of people did different things with that. Harold Bloom, who's a Yale professor of comp lit, put out a book called The Book of J, where he claimed it was his discovery that the author of J was a woman. And he's a thief and a liar. And you know, we get very protective of our ideas, you know, but I did learn very quickly from that and one or two other cases where other scholars stole my stuff, that you can steal ideas and you can't get in trouble for that. Plagiarism is when you steal someone else's words. And as long as you don't say it in their words, you say it in your words, you can steal ideas. Now, it's a little different in inventions and technology. There are other issues there. But as far as literary matters, as long as you have different words, you're okay. And I'm okay with it in the long run. I wasn't okay in my earlier years, but now I'm an older, mature man, you know. And they always use that line, you know, that imitation is the highest form of compliment. And I say, no, theft is the highest form of compliment. You know, that you were worth stealing. You know, that's really nice. The worst part was when Who Wrote the Bible was in press. I had a visiting professor from Israel staying with me, and just before he left after spending a term at our university, he had been walking around visiting used bookstores in town. That's one of professors' favorite things, is we like used bookstores, you know. And he walks over and he puts a gift, a parting gift, in my hand. And I open up and it's an old book, obviously, and it's titled Who Wrote the Bible? I go, oh no. It's like from the 1930s or something. So I called my agent and I said, Elaine, there's already a book called Who Wrote the Bible? And she just laughed and said, you can't copyright a title. So my next book is going to be called Harry Potter and the Philosopher or Sorcerer's Stone. It turns out, what?
Harry Potter and the Ten Commandments.
That's good. Apparently that wouldn't work. You can't steal a title of a currently successful, but where it's obvious that using that title you are impinging on someone else's property and income. But for 99% of books, you can just, you know, if you want to call your next book The Brothers Karamazov, you can do that. Sisters Karamazov. Or Mom Always Liked You Better by Ivan Karamazov, you know, something like that. You don't find that funny? Mm-hmm. They didn't all have the same mom, actually, in that book. So, all right. So what happens? If this beginning scenario is correct, it means that these different texts are not just that we're cutting the Bible up and you go, okay, that's J, that's P, that's E. But rather, you're starting to see how they each came out of the history in that world and were related to the events and persons and times and places of that world. And just as J and E individually were related, I should do it the other way. J and E individually came out of that world. The combination of J and E came out of that world too. When the Assyrians came along and wiped Israel off the map, and I said, well, those 10 lost tribes are not so much lost as refugees living in Judah. Somebody, just one of those guys, running away from the Assyrians in Israel, took a scroll with them. And that scroll had E on it. Because now you've got all these Israelites living down here mixing in with the Judeans. So basically after that, everybody is a Jew, not an Israelite. And they've got now 2 sacred texts floating around. Now, I don't know how sacred they were. Remember, there's no printing press. So it's not like everybody has a copy of J in the bedroom, and some other people have copies of E in the bedroom, and some lucky people have both. All we know is that somewhere, somehow, there are copies of 2 different versions of Israel's story floating around, the J text and the E text. And somebody had the same impulse as the guy who put the Diatessaron together with the New Testament texts. He tried to put them together. So where they were identical, he'd just, use the wording of one of them. He didn't have to write identical wording twice. And where they were in conflict, he would sometimes leave the conflicts in if they didn't bother him that much. And sometimes he would make a change of just a word here and there to reconcile the conflicts. And so he has a fairly light hand as an editor. He's willing to cut a fair amount because J and D each isn't complete when you read it. So we know he's willing to cut stuff. But we know that he isn't changing a million things either. He doesn't say, I don't like the name Abraham. I'm going to make it, Mel. And it's Mel and Isaac and Jacob who are the... So there are things he can tamper with and things that he can't. And those aren't completely in his control either. People talk about this when they deal with it, a lot of scholars, as if the redactor is omnipotent. He can do whatever he wants with the text. That's not true. He doesn't have the power to change the golden calf to something else. He doesn't have the power to make it Abraham and Doug and Jacob instead of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's some things that everybody knows, and they're old stories. And even if he'd like to cut them, he can't do it, because everybody would know then that that's not how I heard it. So there's a dynamic between the editor, the authors, and history. And it's complex, but beautiful, really, the way he puts all that together. Now, if you have a Bible like mine, where you've made your attempt at identifying the different sources with colors based on the particular language each one uses, based on when they have the name of God, based on the references and places, and based on the flow of the text to try to keep each one consistent, all the evidence we have toward identifying them. If you read J-E now, right? So first I'd say, go out and read just J. Go out and read just J-E. I've done each of those many times. I've seen Maltese Falcon 20 times. When I like something, I've seen Kill Bill, I can't tell you how many times now. When you read J, then you read E. Now read the product of R-J-E, the guy who puts the two together. And the two flow as a continuous text without a break. So we've got, I would say, the whole or almost the whole of the combined R-J-E. We do not have a whole J or a whole E. Now, a lot of people say, I would never believe in this documentary hypothesis unless somehow you could find, archaeologically, just a J text, just an E text, just a P text. They say that would prove it, but since those things have never been proven, it's an unlikely hypothesis. And you go, wait a minute. The oldest texts of the Bible that we have are the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? And they're not in good shape. If you've ever seen photographs of the Dead Sea Scrolls or visited when museums have traveling shows of parts of them, or the ones that are housed in Jerusalem in the Shrine of the Book, which is next to the Israel Museum, where there's a perfect duplicate of the book of Isaiah. You know that only Isaiah is complete, and the other 38 books of the Hebrew Bible are incomplete except for the book of Esther, which is completely not there. We have parts of every book of the Old Testament except Esther. And I remember once when the guys who wrote the Bible video with me. After that, they made a show that lasted for several years on television called Mysteries of the Bible. And I was watching one, and they were talking about various mysteries, and they said, after this word from our sponsor, we're going to tell you about a great mystery about the book of Esther. I'm going, mystery about the book of Esther? Oh, I'm sorry, the mystery that the Dead Sea Scrolls revealed about the book of Esther. I'm going, mystery? There is no Esther in the Dead Sea Scrolls. What are they going to say? And then they come back after the commercial and they say, and so it is, this amazing thing about the book of Esther, that it's not there in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That was the mystery. Okay. So if you look at them, a lot of them are torn up. A lot of them, once they were discovered, they were exposed to the air and they have started to oxidize. So they're disappearing. They're getting, the edges are corrupted and the print isn't as clear. So for example, when they were discovered in 47, they photographed them all. And now, of course, we have much better photographic equipment and technology. So they were all re-photographed, like in the 1990s, I think it was. And even with the better, infrared and various technologies that we have now, the rather ordinary camera photographs from 47 and 48 are better on a lot of the scrolls than what we have now, because the scrolls themselves have deteriorated. And it turns out that the best place on earth for the Dead Sea Scrolls was right where they were, rolled up really tightly in one of the driest spots on earth, like just west of the Dead Sea. And as soon as we took them out and were able to see them, it started ruining them. It's the biblical archaeology equivalent of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, or the Schrödinger-Cat case. Am I getting anywhere with this quantum physics stuff? If you look, you can't see it anymore. So someday all we'll have will be electronic in your computers, but the scrolls will be gone, unless they can find some way to preserve them. Some people want to do this thing where you put them inside laminated pages with no air of plastic, but then of course they're forever laminated if you do that. So there's no winning on this. So that is to say, though, the oldest Bible manuscripts we have are from the last century, last 2 centuries BCE, and the 1st century CE, which is to say 2,000, 2,100 years old. But a J or an E or a P would be hundreds of years earlier than that. So you would have to have a manuscript that survived better than the Dead Sea Scrolls did. I mean, the odds of that are like winning the lottery. The odds of that are like being hit by lightning. I mean, it's worse. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So when people say, I'll only believe the hypothesis if you can show me a J, it's just not going to happen. And they're making an unreasonable demand, and they're getting out of having to actually argue the issues of the hypothesis. And you don't really need that to prove the hypothesis. Yeah, it'd be great, I admit. If tomorrow some archaeologist finds not written on leather or parchment, but on, carved in stone, a text that just has J, I admit I'll be as excited as anybody else. That would be great. But I'm not, it doesn't ruin my day if they don't find that tomorrow. Yeah, Jacob.
I have a question. How can we be sure that, like, just take E and J, for example, how are we able to disprove the fact that J and RJE aren't the same exact person? So if E brought down this text to the Southern Kingdom and RJE took the E document and then wrote another alternative history, so RJE and J are the same person.
J is a reduction.
That's
Yeah.
a great question. In the history of this discussion, there have been many variations on this hypothesis. The essential hypothesis, right, is that there are these different documents. And so it's called the documentary hypothesis. I would call it the documentary theory, or just the truth. But we have retained the term documentary hypothesis, even though I think the evidence has put us long past the stage where it was a hypothesis. But okay. But there have been a million tweaks of different versions of that. And some of them are the sort of thing that he just raised. My teacher, Frank Cross, argued that P, which we'll come to, was never an independent source. It was that the author of the P text had the JE combined, the RJE text, and he wrote his stuff around it. He added it all in. And I said to Professor Cross, but then there are contradictions. If they were each written separately and someone puts them together, then I understand why there's contradictions. But if it's one guy writing the text around the other one, why would he deliberately write problems into the text like that? And Professor Cross kind of shrugged and said maybe he just wanted his say. To me, that's not a good enough answer. With all, and you've gathered in what tremendous respect I hold my teacher, but that just wasn't a good enough answer. Now, there have been other sorts of these hypotheses where the documents aren't separate, but that one is a supplement and is intentionally written as a supplement to one of the other ones that existed already. And these are called, real hard to figure out, supplementary hypotheses instead of documentary hypotheses. And the one you mentioned was that, let's say, J was one of these supplementary things, that E exists, and some guy writes J around it. So my first problem with that would be the same as the problem I raised with Cross's hypothesis, that why do they have some pretty blatant contradictions in them? And I don't see an easy way around that. I just don't see how any supplementary hypothesis works. And every now and then, if you read current articles about this, you'll see some people say, well, nobody accepts the documentary hypothesis anymore. We all believe in the supplementary hypothesis now. And then you look, and no two even have the same supplementary hypothesis. This one was written around that one, and that one was written around that one. And it's an interesting idea, but it doesn't work. In my reckoning of the evidence, it doesn't work. And also, arguing against it is, if you just read J and you just read E, neither is complete, but each one is sort of complete within itself. It's self-consistent and all that. Whereas, if one is written around the other, it shouldn't have come out that way. Now, the funny thing was, there's a wonderful article by my former colleague in California, Bill Propp, who did the Anchor Bible Exodus, the 2-volume, 20-year of his life books, a commentary on Exodus. And he wanted to respond to the people who say, well, no, and I won't believe it until I see, you just find P, you just found J. So he said, the title of his article is P Source Found Intact. And he published it with this QC title, but in a serious journal. And what he found was, there's one place where there's a P text, and it says such and such. And then there's some J or E cut in between it. And then there's the next P text. Okay? And then he showed in the prophet Ezekiel quotes the priestly text from here and here continuously as a united, meaning he had seen a version without the J and the E stuck in the middle, the pre-redaction version of P. Now, that was a fabulous piece by Propp. And just recently, I found one, I haven't published it, something similar, I think it was E, where I found where it's here and here, but it's quoted as a united thing somewhere else in the Bible. So that's not quite as good as digging one up in the ground, I admit, but it is evidence that yeah, there actually were people who saw one of a continuous text. Yeah. Sorry?
Ezekiel 20. Ezekiel 20.
I got brilliant students around here. So. Good questions, good answers. All right, so let's come to this priestly source. You got a Mushite priest up here in Israel who's written some very unkind things about Aaron. Aaron made the golden calf. Aaron and Miriam spoke against Moses over his Cushite wife. In both of those, Aaron is put down. In both of those, Aaron has to speak respectfully to Moses and addresses him as Adoni, my Lord. And Moses is the good one. And everything is about Moses. He's the big guy. And now that's combined with J. You got RJE, and they're right here in Jerusalem. You are a priest at the temple in Jerusalem. The priests at the temple in Jerusalem since the days of King Solomon are Aaronid, not Mushite. They just love having this Bible floating around. It's wrong to call it a Bible at this point, but this text floating around saying that your ancestor committed the worst sin of all time. That he was put down by God as having an inferior revelation to Moses' revelation in the Snow White Miriam story. That he made the golden calf and got in trouble and lied about it. And Moses is the good one. What do you do with that? You write your own. And so some Aaronid priest in Jerusalem wrote a different version of the story. And the hypothesis is that this priestly text, the one we call P, is written as an intentional alternative to the J&E text, which he knew. That's why there are parallel stories between the two. So what you do is you get out your legal pad and you draw a line up the middle, and you've got this existing RJE text here, and now you've got this new one, a priestly text written by some priest in Jerusalem. All right? Now, RJE had to have been written, J and E each had to have been written when Israel and Judah were two separate countries. That would make sense. So that means they're between 922 and 722 BCE. P, the RJE has to be like right after 722 when the two get combined. P has to be later than 722 because he's reading an already combined J and E. Who's the main king then? Hezekiah. Remember, Hezekiah is right around 700 BCE. The king who did a big reform, the king who survived the attack by the Assyrians. And according to the book of Chronicles, it was Hezekiah who was the king who made distinctions between the Jerusalem priests and all the rest of the Levites. That is, he was the one who favored the Aaronid priests. So temporarily, let's say P is from around there. But I don't have to fight for dates at the moment. What I'm fighting for is that P is written as a response to this. So if you look at the RJE, what does it start with? The creation story. P has a creation story. Then it has the Adam and Eve Garden of Eden story. Doesn't have it here. Then it has Noah and the flood. He's got a flood. Then it has Tower of Babel. Doesn't have it. Then he's got Abraham and the covenant, the Abrahamic covenant with God. He's got it. Oop. It's got the sacrifice of Isaac. Doesn't have it. And you start going through, and what you see is he's got almost all the stories that the RJE texts have, and in the same order, except that every now and then he's missing one. He's got down here the golden calf story. You think you're going to have that by an Aaronid priest? So that's not there. Now, everything that it does have and everything it doesn't have is explainable within the hypothesis. So you can imagine that this priestly text doesn't have the golden calf story. Would you bet that the priestly text would have a version of the Snow White Miriam story? No, because Aaron's bad in that. In all these places in J, where it says, and the Lord spoke unto Moses, and in E, where it says, and the Lord spoke unto Moses, you'll find passages in P where it says, and the Lord spoke unto Moses and unto Aaron. In J and E, Aaron and Moses are both Levites, but they are not related. Not related. In P, it gives you a genealogy that says Aaron and Moses are brothers, and Aaron is the firstborn, which would be inconsistent with J anyway, because it makes Aaron 3 years older than Moses. And they died, both of them, at the end of the 40 years in the wilderness. So since Moses lived to be 120, Aaron lived to be 123. But that shouldn't be allowed. In J, it says God decrees that no one can live to be more than 120. But in P, he's not thinking about that. In J and E, it's all E actually, when there are the stories of the plagues in Egypt and the splitting of the sea and all that, it is Moses who has a rod that he uses, and with the stick he does the tricks. In P, it's Aaron's rod that is used to initiate the miracles. In E, there's a story in Exodus 17 where the people need water at Meribah, and Moses goes, and it's at the foot of Mount Horeb. It says God is standing on the rock, and Moses strikes the rock, water goes to the people, Moses is great, thank you very much, end of story. In the P version of that same story, which is the one in Numbers 20, again they're at a place called Meribah, and again it's a place where there isn't any water, but in this version, God tells Moses to speak to the rock, and Moses hits the rock, and he disobeys God, he takes credit for it himself. He's punished for this with the worst thing that could happen to Moses. And Aaron, his elder brother now, who's standing right next to him, suffers the same fate of Moses because Moses abuses Aaron's rod. So the priestly versions of all the stories are turning the stories around. So whereas the E versions, which are by a Mushite priest, make Aaron the bad guy, the priestly stories, which are by an Aaronid priest, make Moses, you can't say the bad guy, but he's not perfect either. He hit the rock and took credit when he was supposed to give God the credit. And Aaron suffered because of his sin. In the priestly version, there's a story about Phineas. Now remember, if you look in that chapter, there's two different stories wound around each other. And who wrote the Bible? I've unwound them so you can see each. In the original one, which is J, the Israelites get involved with the women of Moab, and then the women of Moab seduce the Israelite men first sexually, and then to their religion, the worship of Baal Peor. And so they do what any of us would have done under the circumstances. They hang all the heads of the people. And in the priestly version of that same story, suddenly the Moabite women aren't Moabite women anymore. They're Midianite women. Who's married to a Midianite? Who are bad? Midianite women. And in the priestly version, it never mentions Moses' wife. Zipporah's not in there. His sons Gershon and Eleazar are not in there. There's nothing about Moses' family in the P version. But then there's a story where Moses, through obeying God, orders the Israelites to go to war against the Midianites. And after the war's over and they've defeated the Midianites, Moses arrives and says, wait a minute. You just killed all the men. You didn't kill the women, too. The women, they were very bad. They were seducing us about Baal and everything. You should be killing the women, too. So they agree that all the virgin Midianite women can be kept alive, but any Midianite woman who's been with a man, she's executed. That would include Moses' wife, a Midianite woman who's been with a man, or else something. But no matter how you cut that story, it's not good for Moses. That is to say, every story is being transformed. And who's the hero of that story in the priestly version? Phineas. Who is Phineas? The guy who invents shish kebab in that story? Phineas is the grandson of Aaron. And his reward at the end of that story for being so heroic and killing those people in the act in the tabernacle is he gets an eternal covenant of priesthood, which means the priests will always be the descendants of Aaron, not the descendants of Moses. Now, we're going to go on with more of these next time, but you read the story now with that, understanding that this is not just a game of scholars taking out their scissors and cutting up the Bible and ruining it. It's figuring out how all these stories came apart, and then at the end, we'll look at what an incredible thing it was when they all came together. You'll be happy. The Bible comes out even better than you thought.